talk about all of this big breaking news this morning. David Drucker is here, a political analyst and senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Selena Zito joins us, CNN contributor and reporter for the Washington Examiner and a columnist for the New York Post. David Swerdlick is here, our political commentator and assistant editor for the Washington Post. And Laura Coates, our great legal mind and former federal prosecutor this morning. Laura, got to start with you.
Okay.
What exactly did the court do here? And what is the legal impact and what is the political impact?
Well, the court honored what's called the 10th Amendment and said essentially two things. One, the right to actually have federal funding can be conditioned, but it's got to be done beforehand. It cannot be done after the fact. And so when you have the 10th Amendment, it essentially says you cannot just commandeer these individual state and local officers or enforcement agencies to try to take on the role of the federal government. But if you are going to do that, they have to have notice, an opportunity to be heard beforehand. And what it sounds like happened with this particular executive order is that the rug was being pulled out from underneath these cities who took funding, did not know about the new conditions, and now are being asked to align themselves and their prosecutorial priorities with that of Donald Trump's campaign. And that is not going to be an effective strategy when you have Congress who's in charge of allocating those funding.
You know, Selena, this is not the first, this is not the second, but the third time that a federal judge has stepped in to block something having to do with what the president wants to do with the borders or with immigration right now. Is he essentially learning here the power of the judiciary? And second part is, even though he may not be anything done here, is he okay with the political dynamics at play?
Well, to answer the second question, yes, he is okay with the political dynamics at play because it gives him the opportunity to remind voters what he promised he would do and to underscore that through his tweets of why he wanted to have this done. Not only the travel restrictions, which were stopped by a federal judge, but also the sanctuary cities. Look, presidents face this all the time. I think that President Obama had 15 of his executive orders that were that a federal judge interfered on, and so this is a humbling experience. But they all come back out and say, "This is why I want it done. We're going to take it further." Or sometimes they just step back and move on to the next thing. Depends on how politically important that whatever it is to them.
David Drucker, let's talk about what this administration is promising will be the biggest ever, the biggest in history, tax cuts and also tax reform. You might as well hang a $4 trillion sign on Paul Ryan's office door because he's going to have to stomach this and deal with this and get this through Congress. Can he do it, or is it dead on arrival?
Well, I don't think it's dead on arrival. I mean, we're talking about a tax cut proposal primarily, and Republicans love tax cuts. I have detected in conversations with Republicans this morning concern about the deficit and how this proposal would impact the deficit, because even though it would be paid for, according to the administration, via economic growth and according to the administration, their argument is that economic growth would pay for this. But as I was about to get to, a lot of Republicans who do actually believe in dynamic scoring, and that's the technical term for this, are themselves concerned that that is in fact not the case. And so I think that this is going to be a lot more politically tricky than the White House might assume, or maybe they're prepared for that. But here is the larger question, Poppy, to me that's very interesting. Secretary Mnuchin is not just promising a large tax cut. He's saying that that what they're going to do is the largest tax reform in U.S. history. And so I want to see today if they actually propose tax reform. In other words, are they going to propose eliminating a lot of deductions and carve-outs that are very popular with many constituencies, with many Republicans on Capitol Hill? Because reform means simplification, means overhauling how you pay your taxes, what kind of deductions you're able to claim, and all of that. And so if they don't propose something that's very specific and expansive in terms of how you alter the structure of the code, then it's not really tax reform. And the one reason I'm suspicious is because reform is how you pay for it. It's how you eliminate a lot of the deductions that create the revenue to pay for the cuts. And without that, we're not really dealing with tax reform. And if we are, then it's very, very complicated on the Hill. If we're not, it still may be complicated because of the deficit implications, but in some ways it may be easier to create consensus because every Republican is at least theoretically in favor of cutting taxes.
Right. They say this is the biggest tax reform in history, but we have not seen any evidence like a shred, a single proposal, which is reform rather than just a cut. We will wait and see if that comes out today. And on dynamic scoring, this would take more than dynamic scoring to make up $4 trillion. It would take up historically wicked dynamic scoring, the likes of which we have never seen before, in order to make up $4 trillion. But you know, economists, they'll look at that. David Swordlick, there's another aspect of this which is interesting too, and it has to do with the pass downs, which basically means all businesses will be included in some of the tax cuts. And the New York Times has this take: Mr. Trump's decision to extend the corporate tax cut to real estate conglomerates like his own will give Democrats a tailor-made line of attack. I think we could probably put the countdown clock, the CNN countdown clock up here, and it'll be within the hour that we'll hear from Democrats harp on this.
Yeah, John, I think the New York Times is right on that. I think Democrats already had a tailor-made line, just talking about what David was saying a moment ago. There is a lot of skepticism, even privately among Republicans, that you can go from less than 2% GDP growth to over 3% GDP growth just based on dropping the corporate rate, potentially cutting the top marginal income tax rates. Then you add on what you're talking about, John, this idea of extending those, changing the tax code to favor businesses like Trump's. Democrats have talking points. They're already not inclined to give the Republicans help with this. I think the Republicans can do this, but it's going to be a very tough slog to convince enough people to vote for it, especially in the Senate.
All right, guys, stand by.